stream of people joining us. So I think we'll let everybody come in as we start this event. We have quite an ambitious program for today, so we don't want to start off too late. So hello and welcome to all joining us from across the world and certainly from different time zones. Welcome, first of all, to the second Environmental Peacebuilding Conference. We have the singular honor of being the first event in this conference, even before the opening panel, which will take place in a couple of hours. So we look forward to an amazing week. I hope that those of you who are joining us today will also have the opportunity to join several of the other exciting events on the agenda this week. Welcome to the launch and training event for UNEP's environmental and climate security data tool, Strata. My name is Celia Halley. I'm with the Environmental Security Unit of the United Nations Environment Programme, and I manage the EU UNEP partnership on climate change and security, under the auspices of which, with support from the EU, of course, and from the government of Norway, Strata has been developed. I'll be joined in today's presentations and demonstrations by the other members of the Strata team, which of course include our development partners at the University of Edinburgh and at Blox. And we're delighted to have many of you online today, joining us as I can see one by one, including many who we know have participated actively in the development of Strata through end user consultations in Somalia. So thank you very much for being here. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we have an ambitious program for this session, which comprises both a presentation of Strata and a training component. We'll start by providing a relatively brief introduction to Strata, why it was developed, what it does, how it does it, etc., followed by a demonstration that will be provided in plenary, before moving into breakout rooms where all participants will have the opportunity to be guided through using Strata themselves. We'll then come back into plenary for a discussion and a question and answer session before closing with a quick look at next steps. So a couple of quick points on housekeeping before we dive in. Please ensure that your microphones are muted when you're not speaking. You're of course more than welcome to turn your cameras on at any point. We'd love to see you, but we ask that you definitely do so in the breakout rooms or when taking the floor to ask a question. Please raise your hand when you wish to speak and introduce yourselves briefly when taking the floor. And then in terms of questions, we should have a good amount of time for questions and discussion after the breakout session, but do feel free to put your questions in the chat at any time, and we'll make sure that they're picked up either in the breakout rooms or in the final discussion session. And then finally, I should also say that there will be some tech support provided for the tryout session in the breakout rooms, and we'll provide more details on that before we start with that segment. So let's get started. I see you've been staring at this slide for some time already, but this is just a quick overview of what led us to develop Strata and the issues that it's trying to address. So obviously, the impacts of environmental degradation and climate change on food, water, and energy supplies, on livelihoods, on infrastructure are becoming ever clearer, as are the risks that these impacts can exacerbate existing socio-economic drivers of forced displacement, of maladaptation, and of conflict. But the growing recognition and awareness of these linkages has led to, exponentially increasing demand for data-driven analysis of environmental and climate-related security risks to peace and stability. Many organizations, from the UN Security Council to the African Union to the European Union, and many national governments are calling for improved analysis of interlinked environmental, climate change, and security risks to inform response planning, policy making, and of course, programs on the ground. Up to now, however, the capacity for data-driven environmental security assessments has really remained in the hands of quite a limited set of experts who have coding skills, who have Earth observation capacity, and who have access to bandwidth and significant storage capacity. These are all issues for those affected by these these risks in fragile and conflict-affected countries. We also know that commissioning external support for analysis is often costly and often slow. So there's really an urgent need to make environmental and climate security data accessible and readily available to policymakers and practitioners on the ground for free and without prior technical know-how. So these are exactly the gaps that Strata aims to address. Next slide, please. And that's why we're excited to launch Strata at prototype stage today. There are, of course, many concurrent data initiatives out there that aim to meet this demand. You'll hear from some of them, in fact, this week in other events. But we do believe that Strata has a unique value proposition that makes it highly relevant to end users on the ground in fragile and complex contexts, and makes it complementary to other data tools as well. As I've mentioned, it's open access. Anyone with an internet connection can use Strata. Strata also allows users to customize data analytics and visualization to their specific context, as I mentioned before, without prior technical data skills. It also uses near real-time geospatial data streams that are continually being updated. And it provides information at subnational level, so at a much higher level of granularity than is available through most other data tools. And finally, and this is a really crucial point, it's built through co-design with national and local stakeholders, the end users themselves, not only to ensure that it's fit for purpose and that it's relevant to them, but also because we envision the process itself, the process of development, to be an entry point for dialogue and confidence building. And this is also why we're launching Strata at prototype stage today, to ensure that future development of the platform is based on an iterative process with Strata's users. So with that, let me hand over to Ian Woodhouse of the School of Geosciences at the University of Edinburgh, who's led the scientific team developing Strata. And Ian will give us a closer look at what Strata does and how it does it. Ian, over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody, or whatever time zone you're in. So thanks for that introduction. I'll give a little bit of a cover of Strata's objectives and kind of what is working underneath the hood. But to start off, the key thing about what we were trying to do with Strata is that there is a growing need to be able to access all the environmental, climate, security data that is available, and try to bring it together in a way which was going to be easy to analyze, easy to visualize, easy to see, and do some decision making based on that. So the key thing is being able to identify and visualize where environmental and climate stresses are converging. There's a geographic variability in terms of climate and environmental stresses, and they change over time. And so that idea of near real time, because there's data available now that we can get up to the last 24 or 48 hours that are to do with the environment that comes from satellite data. But one of the key challenges is, well, where do you find that data? How do you use it? And then we also looked and built the tool so that it could incorporate peace and security data, but also visualize how the environmental and climate hotspots were overlapping with socioeconomic vulnerability, and how that would drive maladaptation, displacement, conflict. And so being able to generate these hotspot maps. So and I'll explain a bit more detail where that comes from in a second. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is to support the design of policy and programming, use science-based insights to design area-specific climate change adaptation, risk reduction, resilience building, give some environmental intel and situational awareness for the people on the ground. Next slide. Now, the challenge is that there is lots of data out there. There's lots of spatial data, there's lots of environmental data, climate data, but it's not always easy to bring together. If you get one slide too many, that one, thank you. So the key thing of Strata was actually trying to bring all this data together, make it, visualize it clearly, give some customizability for the area, because many many of the existing tools are fairly consistent across lots of areas, and there's not much opportunity to customize or to make changes for local circumstances or particular times of year or particular occurrences in a country that you may want to look at particular drivers more so than others. So we've used what's called a convergence of evidence approach, which I'll explain in more detail in a minute. It was very much rooted in this co-design process to make sure that we were building something that was going to be useful and met the needs of the users. And this customizability is where Blox comes in, and when Sam shows you that, the key thing is that you can modify to some extent what the parameters are that are feeding into the hotspot calculation. Next slide, please. So one of the really important things that came out of the co-design process was identifying what kind of indicators are important. What environmental or climate hazards or indicators should we incorporate into Strata? Now, it's a co-design process, so part of that was a very long list of desired metrics and indicators, and then that had to be combined with the data that was available. So there are certainly some things that we're now looking into that were requested but aren't currently available in a format that's easy to access. So what we did was narrowed it down to these three baskets of data, these indicators. So drought, heat wave, flood, land change have different components in there that are the climate and environmental hazards. And you'll see when you get a chance to actually use Strata is that you get a choice. You can choose which one of these you want to incorporate. The peace and security ones are related to the ACLED data sets that bring in information on things like battles and riots. But we also have the socioeconomic exposure and vulnerability indicators, which at the top level is population, but it also includes things like food security, standards of living, such like. Next slide, please. Now, the way the convergence of evidence approach, so the principal working part of Strata is this convergence of evidence, which the JRC, for example, in their Atlas of Desertification have certainly led the way in developing that as a model. And the idea here is that for each indicator, you define a threshold, and if that threshold is exceeded, you consider it's reached a critical level. So the area gets flagged or red flagged. And then you sum the flags. So in the first column here is the stressor flags to do with climate, environment, peace and security flags. And we identify where all of these areas geographically have crossed a critical level. Now that is very purposefully not a complex model. You can't weight across the different parameters, and because we're quite keen to make sure that it is both straightforward to understand what is happening and so that you can see what's happening, and there's no elaborate complex models behind it. But the red flags, what we do with the red flags is that says that there's something problematic happening, or there's a collection of critical level thresholds that have been exceeded in the climate and environmental or the peace and security context. But we want to also factor in, well, where are people living? So is this happening? Do you have heat waves and low rainfall in an area where nobody actually lives? So some of the previous models of this kind haven't incorporated the exposure. So we incorporate and we weight it by the exposure. And then on top of that, we have a vulnerability score. So it's not just where are people, but are they, do they potentially have a higher risk of is that exposure of a higher risk because of the vulnerability? And so these three factors together is what drives the hotspot map. So when you see a hotspot map, what you're seeing is of an area that comes in red is and the hotspot map is suggesting that there's an area of concern there because multiple indicators have reached the critical level, and there is a high exposure and a high vulnerability. And so that's the purpose of the hotspot map. Next slide, please. So this is the so what slide. So the key thing is that, well, once you've done this calculation in Strata, you've generated a hotspot map. What does that actually mean? And one of the key things to realize is that this is not really a GIS. So some of you might have come across or might be asking, well, if you bring in just all these layers and then you sum them up, can you not just do that in a GIS? Well, it's not a GIS in two very important ways. One is that this is accessing all the data in the background as you run it. And much of that data is up to date. So the data that is about agricultural drought, for example, will be is up to date as just the last few days. And it's also making calculations as you run it. So what it's doing is looking for each area on the map. It's actually looking at what is the baseline. So what has happened in the past. And you can set the timescales and some modifications and that a user can set for that. One of the important things to realize is that it's what we're not doing with Strata is giving a detailed modeling or prediction tool. It is drawing your attention to areas where multiple stresses are occurring in the same location, and it is co-located with areas of high vulnerability or high population. And it's really important to stress that, so we're not feature modeling, it's not quantitative risk probabilities, it's not adding in correlations or the cascading impacts of multiple things happening at the same time. So all of those non-linearities and context-driven parameters are for the user to bring to their interpretation. So this is part of the reason we use the convergence of evidence approach, is that it's purposefully quite a simple way of bringing the data together, which is simply drawing attention to the fact that there are multiple thresholds being crossed. So there's multiple stressors that are happening in a particular area. So the key thing is that it gives you the chance for baseline analysis. It gives you the opportunity for designing, monitoring, evaluating interventions. It's also got important awareness raising and training opportunities in terms of understanding how this data can be used, and the fact that users can look at the individual indicators. So you don't just see the hotspot, you can look at what the individual indicators are contributing to that hotspot. So it's really helpful in terms of in-depth analysis and awareness building and training. And it also offers some opportunity for offering advice and prioritization for decision makers. There is a guidebook, and the guidebook goes through in a lot more detail than I've just done in terms of giving supportive materials of how to help the user interpret what they're seeing in terms of the map output. But the important thing is that users should be integrating their own understanding with the maps that come out from Strata. So that customizability and making it location specific applies very much to the users as well as the tool. So the users are location specific, and the tool gives the users that opportunity to modify or customize for their particular location specific requirements. But there is also a location specific interpretation that has to be applied by the knowledgeable users that bring their own insights to that. And that guidebook will be made available, and that will provide other support material to help interpret and use the tool. So next slide. So I will now pass over to Sam at Blox. So the key reason that Blox was brought in was because, as you'll see, the capacity to make it easy for users to modify and customize the parameters that get fed into Strata. And so that is best done not by me explaining it, but by Sam demonstrating it.
Thank you very much, Ian. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody, depending on where you are. So my name's Sam Fleming, and I am from Blox, who are the technical implementation partner. So we're the ones that have been taking all the hard work that the university have been doing and actually implementing that and building the Strata platform. So in just a minute, I will be sharing my screen with you and introducing you to Strata. So I know that some of you may have seen Strata already, and again, thank you for all your input during that kind of user co-design. But for some of you, this will be the first chance you'll get to see Strata. So before I share my screen and you're all distracted by all the amazing things that I'm going to show you, I thought what I would do is just talk through what I'm about to show you. So we're going to look at Strata within a particular kind of use case or example. And in this case, we're going to be looking at the issue of drought. So obviously drought is a significant kind of climate and environmental issue which can affect lots of people. And so we're going to be looking at a number of different indicators which can tell us about where drought is having the biggest impact. And ultimately the hope is that can then help inform decision making and kind of direct projects and interventions and activities to help have the biggest impact in the right location. So once I share my screen, I'll talk through some of the indicators that we've been looking at here and how this is working on Strata. So I am going to just share my screen with you now. So I'm trusting some of my colleagues to shout out if we can't see this, otherwise I'm going to power on. So welcome to Strata. So what we're looking at here is the dashboard interface. And so here we have some maps, some charts, some tables, each providing us with information about what's happening on the ground in Somalia around the issue of drought. So we've heard Ian talking a little bit about the different indicators that can feed into Strata. So just very briefly, I'm going to kind of talk through the indicators that we're looking at just now. So we're looking at drought. So there's two different ways that we can kind of analyze drought. So the first is meteorological drought, which is by looking at patterns in rainfall and understanding whether the rainfall that we're seeing right now, how that compares to a historical average. So if there's a low level of rainfall, that's meteorological drought. Agricultural drought is where we are again using satellite data to look at indicators relating to the health of vegetation. So and again looking at that kind of historical kind of average, trying to account for the fact that particularly agriculture changes throughout the year and throughout the seasons, and identifying where it's crossing critical thresholds that there's an issue. So lack of rainfall and the health of the vegetation is a concern. In addition, we are looking at land degradation. So again, that's looking at the quality of the land and how much and how much that's been impacted. So if we have low rainfall, the vegetation appears to be unhealthy and the land is degraded, that's obviously a bigger issue than if you don't have all three of those. In addition to that, we're looking at kind of peace and security indicators. So in this case, we're looking at battles, which is essentially a violent interaction between armed groups. So we're looking at places where there's a number of different indicators around the environmental aspects of drought, but also where we're already seeing issues related to peace and security. So this tells us where we need to be looking at making some effort. And finally, we're looking at vulnerability as well. So and in this case, we're going to be looking at food insecurity. So all these factors, as well as locations where there is an existing insecurity for the provision of food. And so that's what we have appearing up on the map here. So on the map here, we're highlighting some of the regions in Somalia where a number of these different indicators are all converging in the same location. So it's telling us the areas that are most at risk for severe issues related to drought. So from the map, we can see that the southern part of Somalia is obviously having more issues surrounding drought than the northern part. So we can see this broken down by geopolitical regions within Somalia, but we can also see from the chart here, we can see how the different scores in different locations are how they're made up from those different indicators. So we can see that the district of Banadir is the area with the largest kind of score that's telling us this is where the biggest risk is, and so this is around the capital of Mogadishu. So So considerably higher than some of the others, but you can, even within that, you can see a number of the other locations where we might be concerned about what's happening. By scrolling down on the dashboard, we can see the kind of some of the data and numbers behind this. We can see the individual contributions from the different indicators and how that all amounts up using the convergence of evidence approach to give that kind of overall score. Further than this, we can break it down into different districts. And so we can see within a particular district, we can see what some of the issues are. So within different areas, within different regions, we can dig in a bit further. And again, just allowing us to see, well, what are the different contributions of different indicators. And again, breaking this down, we can pull out a lot of this data. So all of the data can be exported and extracted straight out of Strata so that it's not just kind of, this information isn't just contained within the platform, it's also able to be extracted and exported elsewhere. So I'm now also going to show you the map interface. So this is where we can see the hotspots. So previously the maps were focused around the kind of geopolitical boundaries, which is helpful when working with policymakers, but sometimes being able to dig in a little bit more deeply and look at specific locations and what the issues are occurring and where. So we can see here that there's a specific areas where we might want to focus our efforts, and particularly if you're familiar with kind of what's happening on the ground here, you might choose to focus your efforts on particular communities or different locations. So this is how outputs are kind of surfaced within Strata. This is how we see everything coming out. But I guess the next question that is, how do we build up this analysis? So here we have this is our workflow. And so this is the kind of builder tool. And this is where we've been pulling in these different indicators, which are these different colored blocks within our convergence of evidence approach. And so thinking about customizability, we can click on the drop down and we can choose between a number of different indicators. So if it's not drought that we're interested in, it's flooding, for example, we can change that and really build that kind of customized and tailored analysis around, well, what are the issues we want to address and how can we address those, and what information do we need to make those informed decisions. Alongside that, we have information about each of the different indicators, where that data comes from, what that actually means, what does battles actually mean, where does that data access. So again, providing a bit more depth to the information that is being provided through Strata to again allow that kind of informed decision making. And then at the bottom of our workflow, we have a number of these different blocks here, which essentially allow us to customize and tailor exactly how these outputs come up on the map and also what's shown on the dashboards. So essentially the builder tool, I guess the dashboards and the map provide users with the information that they're looking for, but the builder tool allows you, our users, to kind of customize and tailor and really dig in a bit more deeply into answering specific questions. And that even goes down to being able to set and change the different thresholds. So if you have an understanding of what causes particular issues, you can change those thresholds to choose different flags or when that's being flagged. So really kind of that's where that kind of customizability comes into things. So I think now we're going to be breaking out into, we're going to be moving out into different breakout rooms. And I think we're going to be digging in a little bit more deeply with this particular example. And we'll be going through a bit of a training session with you, but also an opportunity for a bit of discussion around the methodology, the data, how this might be used. So I think shortly the kind of organisers will be putting you all into breakout rooms. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I think now it's time to move into our breakout rooms.
So back to you, Marie.
Well, I hope you've all enjoyed playing around and trying out Strata. I hope it worked out a little bit for most of you and you got a feeling of how it works. We didn't have much time for questions and answers in our breakout room. So we now will move into a general Q&A session, a discussion where you can bring up all your questions, all your comments, all your feedback, any thought you had about Strata. And yes, maybe we can first start with some questions that people had from the breakout rooms that weren't able to be answered yet. I see one hand raising up from Karen already. That's great. Karen, please.
Hi, thank you. I think it was almost answered at the end of our session, but and it might be in all the information that will be provided separately. But I guess my question was more about how some of the yellow and the blue indicator, the blue boxes, where's that information coming from? Where is the number of battles? Who is determining the information for things like protests? There's displacement and there's internally displaced people. So I think it was more about, where are you grabbing that data from? And I guess the question is, how accurate is that data? Because it's not something like temperature that you can, that everybody can agree upon, the temperature in that region. So that was my question.
So all the indicators for the peace and security basket, so that's the blue one that you referred to, that comes directly from ACLED. So that's the I forgot what the A stands for, but it's a conflict event database, and Armed conflict, thank you very much. Event database, but it actually encompasses more than only armed conflicts. It also encompasses riots, it also encompasses protests. So we base it on them. Their data is updated every week, more or less. While we cannot do a weekly update of that data, we import it more or less every 3 months, their newest data. So that's where it comes from. And further, they get their data then again from like newspaper sources and local experts on the ground. And also, if you're interested in learning more of where the data sources come from, you can click the little eye icon next to the indicator within the platform, and that should give you like the source of the data and when it was last updated and so on. I see we have another question from Anne.
I was really sort of building on Karen's point there about the security indicators, because I wondered if it was possible to include some of the weak social cohesion indicators, maybe from the Fragile States Index, where you're looking at factionalized elites or group grievances being there, because that sort of is the precursor to the conflicts and the battles. But that is so important in terms of peace building when you've got resource conflicts and such like going on. And I wondered if that had been considered or rejected for any reason.
Yeah, so we haven't looked at that data specifically, actually, because I haven't heard about that data, but often the socioeconomic data that you can find and the more like soft variables on peace and security are often on a countrywide scale, and then that would be a reason for us not to use them, because there is no differentiation, for example, within Somalia. So we would just indicate Somalia has this thing, but we cannot show whether one region is more vulnerable or another region is less vulnerable. So that's why we haven't taken, like, why some of the indicators that you might know from other indices we cannot use, because they're on a country scale. Yeah,
thanks.
Are there any other questions that were lingering from the breakout rooms, or were there any maybe important insights or questions there, discussion points that you would want to bring up here? Nikolai.
Thank you. I don't know whether my insight is important, but I'd like to make 2 remarks. One is purely technical. I did not manage to make Strata fully work on a Mac. It may be designed for a PC. If it's not, then I would be happy to learn how to use it there. Another insight is actually related to what was said now. Given all the uncertainties, given the spatial resolution of the initial data which are accessible, I think it's a very interesting tool to visualize what is available. But in reality, what we get at the output is basically a fairly sort of qualitative picture of where the issues may arise. And we had a question in the group about the interpretation, whether there is a danger of misinterpretation. Of course, there is. But in a way, it's very, very much dependent on who is looking at it. I agree with that. What I'm saying, it basically is a nice complement to purely qualitative analysis. But it's not really quantitative per se. It gives an impression of high precision. In reality, the precision is not that high in terms of the resulting outputs. So it's a good tool, but I would just caution against seeing it as a, let's say, advanced data analysis instrument. It basically is supporting qualitative judgments, which could be made without, but would be strengthened using this. Thank you.
Yeah. Exactly. I think you described it well. So we don't try to give the impression that we can do full integrated climate security analysis with the tool. It's definitely, we try to give the data-driven evidence or the data that is out there, actually make it available so people can use it to strengthen their climate security analysis. And therefore you still definitely need this qualitative insight still on how these different indicators are actually linked, how they might be impacting each other and exaggerating each other as well. On how, yeah, we had this discussion or short mentioning in our breakout group on how it might be dangerous to stigmatize communities and how it might actually depend on the users, how they will eventually use the data. That's very true. We have done some ethical assessments on indicators that we then decided not to take in those indicators because of ethical concerns. For example, like having an indicator that shows ethnicities and showing that maybe some ethnicities would be more vulnerable than other ethnicities. So we do try to take caution with that and not include too many indicators that would have very stigmatizing effects. And then like a third thing that you mentioned about uncertainty and how uncertain we are actually about what we show. I mean, that relates to the underlying data, of course, that we use, that we don't produce ourselves, but then also that gets kind of aggregated and accumulated by adding up all these indicators together. And maybe Ian, would you want to say a bit more about that? Because we had some discussions about this during the scientific development.
Oh, I missed that. I was just answering Nikolai in the chat there, so I missed the specific question. I'll very quickly make that chat. Just generally, I don't think it's a Mac problem. If we can find out exactly what, if you are having problems, if you can just be specific and say, well, is it just not working? As Nikolai was suggesting, that there's some right mouse clicking that doesn't seem to be working. Somebody in the tech team can probably pick that up. It's definitely not because it's a Mac, because we are all on Macs. So it's maybe a browser issue, but I think I'll let the tech team take that on. But if you can be specific and specify in the Mac if there's something not working, what is it that's exactly not working, and we can try to fix that. But Marie, remind me, what was the specific question?
The question was about uncertainty within the platform, and that how we deal with that. How can people deal with that?
So we have been looking at, I guess maybe confidence is a better word than uncertainty, because some of them are very qualitative parameters, and we can quantify quite well what the uncertainty might be in those parameters. The other ones are maybe less so. And also, so we did investigate that and try to think of ways in which we might visualize the confidence on the output. We are not quite at that stage yet, because there's other things that we need to factor in, such as the latency of the data. So if the data is the best available data, but it's 10 years old, it's reasonable to say that you would be less confident in that than something that is more recent. So trying to factor that in as well is a challenge. But I think Nikolai raised the very important point, and I think we do try to emphasize exactly what you were saying, Nikolai, is that it is not a quantitative magical tool that gives you a number that you can say, look, this number is 0.7 And so this is physically meaningful. It's not that kind of tool. It's an aggregation of data which is otherwise disparate and difficult to bring together, or difficult to find the tools that could calculate these parameters very quickly. And what Strata does is brings them together so that you can see and have that level of transparency, so you can pick it apart and say, well, what are these factors what is this data? And because it's very clear in where the data sources are coming from and the timings and how it's calculated, the user is free to make a judgment as to whether or not that's reliable. And that's part of the design purpose of Strata, is that you then, if you find one of the indicators to be unreliable in the country that you're looking at, you can drag it out, put it in the bin, not use it. In perhaps some future version of Strata, there will be an easy way to accommodate local data. So there may be country-specific data that users have access to, and they can use that instead. So you may have the capacity to incorporate your own data that you consider to be more reliable. We're not at that stage yet, but that's certainly something that we've had discussions about, and would be perhaps in a later version.
Thanks, Ian. We also have Alessandra who has her hand up.
Yeah, I had a question on the indicator of life standards, and I was wondering if there is an indicator that addresses inequality or differences into resource distribution or access. But then listening to you, Marie, I guess maybe that has been not included for ethical implications, or because I didn't see, but maybe.
Yeah, no, we don't have an indicator specifically in general about that, like differences in access to resources, for example, no poverty indicator or anything like that. You could use the nighttime lights emission, so access to electricity, as a proxy for that. But generally, again, for those types of indicators, often that's based on, let's say, surveys, or let's say, yeah, kind of like nationwide indexes, and that's why it's difficult to import them on a continuous basis in a geospatial manner in this platform. But we're continuously looking for those indicators, definitely also on governance indicators. I saw there's a question about that in the chat. Those are very difficult ones, very important ones for the climate security debate. If you have any data sources or ideas that we should dig in further, please let us know. Otherwise, we will be searching ourselves as well for more of these indicators, and kind of like keep on developing, keep on updating Strata as we go. I hope that, yeah, you go.
But it's right, so it's still about the average of access to electricity, right? You don't look at the standard, at the deviation of answers. So how many has access? And
no, indeed, but we could make an indicator like that. But the point is also that we show the difference over in a geospatial manner, right? We can show here you have more access, there you have less access. So you kind of interpret that yourself. We don't show, because we have such a granular visualization option that people can actually see that themselves, and you don't need to show, okay, within this bigger region there are big differences, because you can show that visually. Here is the region with high, and here is the region with low access to certain, well, to electricity or nightlight emissions. I think next one was Adrian.
Thanks, Marie. First, congratulations to you all. It's a huge development. I think some of you who know, when I was getting into this space, it was the first thing I asked for, and I sort of wanted it ready, and I said, just be a little patient, because it was the first thing talking in Nepal about this topic that was so evident that it's needed in discussions with government, civil society, etc. So that's one. Two, a compliment to the way that it's the sort of diversity of indicators allows, if you follow the council debate, and India's really concerned about as they, air quotes, the militarization of climate security space. And what I like about this is that it shows a range of vulnerabilities and risks. And for example, in Nepal, the problem is dispute. It's not conflict. It's the protest side. It's at that end of risk. And I think I can immediately see a range of indicators that are useful for us here. One question that we talked a little bit about, I just don't remember exactly if there was a plan, but in terms of, yes, right now, and this is the beta and it's static to the last starter that we've got, but there's such an urgency to do at least some basic modeling in very macro discussions with government officials and civil society and researchers. If there's any sense you can give us of when there's even just like a way to show or dialogue with and facilitate discussion around what does 1.5 look like, what does 2 look like, what does 2.5 in what time frame. Doesn't need to be anything like the granularity that you've got here for current time stamped, but it's so essential for us working on change processes and advocacy and the sort of action end of this. And lastly, I'm really interested to see what it looks like when it's printed. A number of us, I think in a couple of calls, we're always asking, where does that come from? And then that, as Marie, you said, you click the little eye and it shows you. Really interested to see that when you print it, all of our interlocutors are going to ask that same question. And sectoral people will ask that same question. So how do you actually reference a map like this? That somebody can just look at it and be quite grounded and believing in it at a pretty quick speed and not just asking questions that undermines the efficacy of the information being presented. Thanks, Ella.
Thanks a lot, Adrian. Those are really, really relevant comments and helpful comments for us as well. So to understand very much from where you're working and what the needs are on the climate projection data. So we are planning in the coming months to have at least 3 climate projection indicators. So exactly like you say, based on projection models. So that means we're not doing the modeling ourselves, but we're including indicators from those models. And that could then, for example, say in 2050, if we follow scenario 4.5, you will have this kind of situation for droughts or for flooding or for heat waves. The features that we need to develop for that are also how to combine different timelines for different indicators, for example, because those will be forward looking, but we will still be overlaying this and comparing that with vulnerability data of how those communities are exposed now and how vulnerable those communities are now. So that's also, we need to think through how we communicate that well, because definitely for the more socioeconomic indicators, we're not going to include as many projections. Potentially just for population density, you could do some projections, but many of the other ones is just, it has not much added value to try and project those as well. So we just need to find a way how to communicate how that we combine different timelines within one tool, but it's definitely in the time horizon for the coming 6 months. And then your second question was, where does this come from? How to reference? So that's a very good point, actually. Like, we could think about in the download tool to add some basic comments on like data derived from all these lines and then aggregated by Strata. So that's a very helpful comment. Thanks so much. And we have a hand up from Ben.
And just to add to that, Marie, there's a paper that will be hopefully published sometime this year that will allow something that can be cited as a source that explains the various features of Strata.
And that kind of like gives a foundation to the scientific framework behind it, like, that it will be scientifically accepted by the scientific community. Sorry, Ben, back to you.
No problem. Thank you very much, and thanks for putting together this amazing tool. Sorry that I was a bit late to the process, so this may have been covered already, but we've also been working with big data sets and trying to produce particularly focus on social risk. And obviously one of the problems is that there are lots of issues that we recognize are very important, but we can't actually represent in data. So I guess I was just wondering what areas or what drivers of risk you kind of felt that you weren't really able to include, the most important ones because of those data limitations, and whether you've got any recommendations about how the tool might be used in collaboration with, say, qualitative expertise on a particular location in order to address some of those kind of potential inevitable shortcomings given the weaknesses in the data at the moment.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of data, like points on my list on like how to improve data about socioeconomic indicators. So one very important one is social cohesion in communities. That's a very important one in our field of work. Quality of governance and quality of institutions on a subnational level. So from a local to a subnational level, those are very important ones. And I would say migration, IOM is working very well on migration with the DTM, the displacement tracking matrix, and also on transhumance, so transhumance tracking matrix. But the fact is that often whenever you have data on any of these issues, it's very like broken up. It's for certain areas, it's for certain timescales. It's not very, you cannot do analysis over very long times or over very widespread areas. For Africa, you have the Afrobarometer, who can help a lot with some of these issues. Otherwise, we would just really recommend to complement Strata's data-driven maps with surveys in the area that you're active, with semi-structured interviews, focus group interviews, to really catch those indicators. Yeah, so those are some of the issues that we're working on. Would be nice to also get like more data-driven evidence on this. There are some ideas or some good initiatives that was like social media and like automatic news analysis, like automatic language analysis, those kind of things. But that's not readily available yet, and often in the most vulnerable places and in the most conflict affected places, those people actually don't have social media or don't have a well-working news coverage and so on. So probably the qualitative approach is still better there. And I would say, yeah, those topics that I mentioned would be the most important. So I don't see any more hands. I see there were a lot of questions in the chat, and I'm sorry that we weren't able to address them all, but we're moving towards the end of this session, and I don't want to go over time because it will be a whole more week of sessions, and I don't want to get you tired already from the first session onwards. So I hope some of the questions will be answered by the team in the chat, but otherwise feel free to follow up with us with those questions, and we're happy to answer them by email. Devashri, could you share the slide, please? Because we have one more slide. Oh yeah, so this is the team that you saw probably several of in the breakout rooms, and who you're also very welcome to contact with any kind of questions. The one more slide that I want to show is the next one, which is about our next steps actually with Strata. So as we mentioned, this is like a launch of a prototype of the Somalia version. So why we launched it as a prototype is because we want to do iterative development. We want to show it to people, we want to get feedback, and we want to be able to react and incorporate that feedback as soon as possible within the development process. So some of the plans for the coming months based on previous feedback already will be to improve usability and open access of the platform, so that you, for example, do not need a login for all the features, but only maybe for the building part. But for the maps, and for if you just want a default map and you want the dashboard, you would be able to just enter it like that. And we would, yeah, improve a little bit the ease of use and the indications and the intuitivity of how to use the platform. Second of all, like Adrian asked about, is that we will be including climate change projection indicators. Oh, and one more thing about improving usability and open access. So we will be sharing a short survey also at the end of this session, just to get your quick feedback. It has 6 questions, I think, just to know what are the most important features, when it is helpful, when it is helpful. So if you have a couple of minutes time, I would be very grateful if you could fill in that survey. but so that we can incorporate your feedback and improve the next versions of Strata. So next to improving the usability and climate change projection indicators, we'll also work on our evaluation of the general tool, its relevance and its use on the ground, but also the ethical side of it, and we'll be starting an ethical review process of it. And then lastly, there was also a question about this in the chat. There will be regional expansion of the tool, starting with the Horn of Africa. So we'll definitely be doing the Horn of Africa, but we'll be working towards other regions. It depends a little bit on the requests that come to us where we will start first, but by regional expansion, we will be working towards a global platform in 2023. And then I think the question in the chat was, how fast can it go? It can go really fast. If you just want the same indicators as we have for the Somalia prototype, for example, it can be set up in like 3 weeks. We do a bit of data testing, but the real value, as was mentioned a bit earlier, is really this co-design process with end users. And depending on how intense you want to do that co-design process, it can take half a year, it can take a year. But so that is very flexible from, let's say, 3 weeks to half a year. And with that, I think we can come to the end of our presentation and our session, our first training session of the Environmental Peacebuilding conference. I would like to really thank the scientific team at the University of Edinburgh and the technical team at Blox for the really nice cooperation up to now. Oh, I see Ian has his hand up. Or is that a legacy?
Oh, I just wanted to say this because it's no, it was just because it's a big milestone for Strata in terms of presenting it publicly. So it was just to say well done to the team, but especially to UNEP. So everybody at the UNEP who had the vision and the foresight to take this forward and to spot Blox as a particularly unique way to make this happen. So thank you to the UNEP team for pushing it forward.
Thanks, Ian. Yes, also big thanks to you at the university and at Blox for making this real. Then we also want to thank the group on Earth observations and Google Earth Engine that actually provide access to Google Cloud and to all these data streams that we can just work on and build on top of. They might not be very visible, but they are very important in these kind of endeavors. We want to thank our partners, the government of Norway and the European Union for their commitment and for their partnership. Then we want to thank all our stakeholders in Somalia, of course, who have been through a long and lengthy and intense co-design process with us, which was very important to come to where we are now, and we're looking forward to test the product and work more together with them, ensure that it's useful for them. And then last of all, I want to thank you all, of course, for being here and being interested in learning about our new tool, about Strata, and helping us progress our product throughout this discussion, throughout all your comments in the chat. So we're very grateful for that. And we hope you will enjoy the rest of the Environmental Peacebuilding Conference. And I hope to see many of you in other sessions again as well. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
I'll be leaving as well. Bye, everyone. Thanks a lot for the help.